More than 250 years ago, New York City built a fence. The colonial settlement lacked protection against French and Indian raiders coming down the Hudson River from the north, so in 1745, black and white inhabitants were put to work constructing a log wall that stretched all the way from the Hudson to the East River. South of this crude boundary, on the tip of Manhattan Island, stood the expanding town that a century earlier had been the Dutch village of New Amsterdam. The new fortification, built along what is now Chambers Street, guarded the homes, gardens, and churchyards of the thriving township. It even sheltered the local jail. The low wetlands to the north, just outside the wooden palisade, contained plots that the authorities preferred to exclude from the community. There stood the town's powder house, surrounded by a pond of fresh water to limit the danger if the gunpowder exploded. And there stood a graveyard assigned to African Americans. It appears clearly on the 1775 map, labeled Negroes' Burial Ground. The location of this graveyard, beyond the fence, was not accidental. In 1697, the city had passed a law excluding blacks from white churchyards in lower Manhattan, and the African population, already more than 700 people, had taken over a desolate site well beyond the town's limits. During the 18th century, the field just east of Broadway became the resting place for well over 10,000 persons. A few were European strangers and poor whites, but most were black New Yorkers, both slave and free. In 1745, when the fence was built, more than 20% of all New York residents were black, and life expectancy was short, so funerals were frequent, and the burial ground filled up rapidly. By the time of the American Revolution, new caskets were being stacked above the old, and after 1790, other graveyards were established as the city expanded. By the late 20th century, the cemetery located 2 blocks north of New York City Hall had been covered over by a parking lot and forgotten. Then suddenly, in 1990, New York City sold the parking lot between Duane and Reed Streets for the construction of a new government office building, and the Black Burial Ground was rediscovered. Since Lower Manhattan is one of the world's busiest places, much had been destroyed by generations of builders, but several spots directly under the city streets had never been disturbed. By 1992, archaeologists had excavated the remains of some 420 individuals, men, women, and children. It had been 2 centuries since the plot had closed, and the people buried there had lacked many worldly possessions. And yet, in coffins resting 16 to 28 feet below street level, specialists could still find revealing clues. A man had been killed by a musket ball. A woman had been buried with glass beadwork in symbolic African cowrie shells. According to city archaeologist Dan Pagano, it's like finding lost volumes of African American history. After resting silently for more than 200 years, these fragile remains were swiftly surrounded by a swirl of national publicity and controversy. A scientific team from Howard University received permission to transport the bones to their laboratory so they could be analyzed carefully and then respectfully returned to the ground. Meanwhile, after much public debate, the site itself appears destined to be preserved. Black musician Noel Pointer teamed with local groups to collect more than 100,000 signatures on a petition seeking landmark status for the burial ground. As Pointer put it, the bones of our ancestors have risen again to remind us of the pain and promise that is the African American journey in America. This book is about the pain and promise of the Black heritage in colonial America. For too long, the story of African arrival and survival in this strange new land has remained buried and nearly forgotten outside the fence of conventional American history. Recently, historians and archaeologists have made dramatic headway in unearthing the general outlines and rich detail of this complicated and powerful story. They are rediscovering, first of all, What a long story it is. Early black history in North America begins shortly after the arrival of Columbus in the New World, and it stretches out from the time of Esteban, the 16th century explorer of the Southwest, to the days of Crispus Attucks, the 18th century sailor who died in the Boston Massacre. This initial journey covers 2.5 centuries, more time than all the dramatic chapters of African American history from the American Revolution to the present day. Scholars are also rediscovering what a varied story lies hidden in this distant period. The lives of our earliest African ancestors were as diverse as graves in which they were eventually laid to rest. And we can still see how different those grave sites were. When you visit an isolated slave cemetery in the Georgia Sea Islands, you can encounter traditions brought from the Congo-Angola region of Africa, where graves were decorated with the last used or most favorite objects of the deceased. Cups and pitchers are broken to release their power and turned upside down to assist the traveler in the next world. Shining objects are polished so that the sun's rays can reflect the continuing flash of the departed spirit. In contrast, when you visit colonial cemeteries in New England, you can confront very different memorials. In the corner of a country churchyard in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, I have seen a headstone of Violet, a black woman born in 1729. She and her daughter were the slaves of James Baldwin of Woburn, Massachusetts, and they were purchased and freed by an African-born leather tanner named Amos Fortune, who had bought his own liberty in 1769. Violet was 50 when she married him, and according to her large slate gravestone, she was 73 when she died, having outlived her husband by less than a year. They are buried side by side beneath matching headstones, and the inscriptions are still legible after 200 years. Sacred to the memory of Amos Fortune, who was born free in Africa, a slave in America, he purchased liberty, professed Christianity, lived reputably, and died hopefully, November 17th, 1801, 91 years old. Sacred to the memory of Violet, by sale, the slave of Amos Fortune, by marriage, his wife, by her fidelity, his friend, in solace, she died, his widow. September 13th, 1802, 91 years old. Also legible, just barely, is a very different marker in God's Acre, the Moravian graveyard in Old Salem, North Carolina. The small rectangular stone, laid flat in the ground amid row upon row of similar markers, seems to say Abraham Najer Guinea, meaning that Abraham the Negro was born in Africa, and the faint number suggests that he died in 1797 at the age of 67. It was shown to me recently by my friend John Sensbach, who has researched the life of Abraham and other black slaves in the records of the Moravian community. Our dear brother Abraham, a Negro from the Mendigo Nation on the coast of African Guinea, was born about the year 1730, states a brief account preserved in the church archives. Captured in war as a young man and sold into slavery, he had been brought in 1771 to Salem, where he married and joined the church. Like Amos Fortune, he worked as leather tanner until his death. Following Moravian tradition, he was buried beside the other married brethren of the community, and only a few feet away from the man who had been his master. For each marked grave, such as Abraham's, there are hundreds, even thousands of unmarked graves, like those placed outside the Palisade in 18th century New York. We can never bring back these African American forebears from the colonial past, but we can work to remove at last the fences that have separated and hidden them for so long. In a sense, their weary bones, and their proud spirits rest under all the huge buildings in the strange new land called America. This is a portion of their story.